Hen arrogance meets its match. The fall is devastating. Watch what happens when a wealthy woman's cruelty backfires in the most shocking way possible. The crystal chandeliers of Grandview Manor Restaurant cast their golden light across the pristine dining room where society's elite gathered for their weekly display of wealth and status. Among the perfectly set tables and designer flower arrangements, one woman stood out not for her beauty, but for the cruel satisfaction that danced in her eyes as she prepared to unleash her latest act of public humiliation. Victoria Sterling adjusted her diamond necklace with the precision of someone who had turned cruelty into an art form. Her perfectly manicured fingers drummed against the mahogany table as she surveyed the restaurant like a predator selecting its prey. Tonight was special. Tonight, she would remind everyone present exactly where they stood in the social hierarchy she had spent years constructing around herself. The restaurant buzzed with the quiet murmur of expensive conversations, the gentle clink of crystal glasses, and the soft rustle of designer fabrics. Victoria's husband, Alexander, sat across from her, his attention focused on his phone as he handled what appeared to be urgent business matters. He had grown accustomed to these dinners, these displays of social dominance that his wife seemed to crave more than the expensive meals they consumed. "Darling," Victoria's voice carried the honeyed tone she used when plotting something particularly vindictive. "I believe our service tonight has been absolutely unacceptable." Alexander glanced up briefly, his expression neutral. After years of marriage, he had learned to recognize the warning signs in his wife's voice, the slight elevation in pitch, the way her words became more precisely enunciated, the almost imperceptible smile that played at the corners of her mouth. These were the indicators that someone was about to become the target of Victoria's legendary wrath. "The food seems fine to me," Alexander replied diplomatically, returning his attention to his phone. He had long ago stopped trying to intervene in his wife's public performances, finding it easier to simply endure them and deal with the aftermath privately. Victoria's smile widened, but there was nothing warm about it. "Oh, it's not about the food, darling. It's about standards. It's about maintaining the proper order of things." Across the dining room, Emma moved between tables with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of high-end service. She carried herself with quiet dignity, despite the exhaustion that tugged at her shoulders after another double shift. Her uniform was immaculate, her smile genuine, and her service impeccable. She had no idea that she had already been selected as the evening's entertainment. The young waitress approached their table with professional courtesy, her notepad ready and her demeanor respectful. "Good evening, Mrs. Sterling. Is there anything else I can bring you this evening?" Victoria's eyes narrowed as she studied Emma's face, searching for any sign of the superiority complex she was convinced all service workers secretly harbored. Finding none, she felt her irritation spike. How dare this girl appear so composed, so unaffected by her obvious social inferiority? "Actually, yes," Victoria's voice carried clearly across the suddenly quiet dining room. "I'd like to discuss the absolutely deplorable state of service we've received tonight." Emma's expression remained calm and professional, though a slight furrow appeared between her brows. "I apologize if something has been unsatisfactory, Mrs. Sterling. Please let me know how I can make it right." The response only fueled Victoria's anger. The girl's composure, her refusal to cower or grovel, felt like a personal affront. In Victoria's world, people like Emma were supposed to know their place, supposed to demonstrate appropriate deference to their betters. "Make it right?" Victoria's laugh was sharp and cutting. "My dear girl, do you have any idea who you're speaking to? Do you understand the position you're in?" Around them, other diners began to take notice. Conversations grew quieter, heads turned slightly, and the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted as everyone sensed the approaching storm. Margaret, the restaurant manager, appeared at the edge of Victoria's vision, clearly preparing to intervene if necessary. Emma maintained her professional composure, though her knuckles whitened slightly as she gripped her notepad. "Mrs. Sterling, I'm committed to providing excellent service to all our guests. If there's a specific issue, I'd be happy to address it immediately." The young woman's continued dignity in the face of Victoria's obvious aggression sent a wave of fury through the wealthy socialite. How dare she refuse to be properly intimidated? How dare she speak with such confidence as if she were anything more than hired help? "The issue," Victoria said, rising slowly from her chair, is that people like you seem to have forgotten your place in this world. Alexander finally looked up from his phone, his expression sharpening as he recognized the dangerous tone in his wife's voice. He had seen her angry before, had witnessed her capacity for cruelty, but something about tonight felt different. There was an edge to her behavior that made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite define. "Victoria," he said quietly, his voice carrying a warning that went unheeded. But Victoria was beyond hearing. The combination of Emma's composure, the watching crowd, and her own need to assert dominance had created a perfect storm of malicious intent. She moved around the table with predatory grace, her heels clicking against the polished floor like a countdown to destruction. "You walk around here with such confidence," Victoria continued, her voice growing louder with each word. "Such pride, as if you're anything more than someone paid to bring food to your betters." The restaurant had fallen completely silent now. Even the kitchen staff had paused in their work, sensing the tension that crackled through the air like electricity before a storm. Margaret took a step forward, but Victoria's reputation and her husband's influence made direct intervention a delicate matter. Emma stood her ground, though she could feel her heart racing. She had dealt with difficult customers before, but there was something particularly venomous about Victoria's approach that set it apart from routine complaints or even typical rudeness. "Mrs. Sterling," Emma said quietly, "I'm simply trying to do my job to the best of my ability." "Your job?" Victoria spat, moving closer until she was standing directly in front of the young waitress, "is to serve people who matter, people who contribute something meaningful to society, not to stand there with that insufferable look of dignity on your face." What happened next would be seared into the memory of everyone present. Victoria, driven by a rage that had been building throughout the evening, reached out and grasped the fabric of Emma's uniform. With a sudden, violent motion, she pulled hard, causing the material to tear with a sound that echoed through the silent restaurant like a gunshot. The shock of the moment froze everyone in place. Emma stumbled backward, clutching at her torn uniform, her face flushing with humiliation and disbelief. Victoria stood triumphant, a satisfied smile playing across her features as she surveyed the damage she had inflicted. But as the initial shock began to fade, something unexpected happened. Alexander Sterling, who had spent years quietly enduring his wife's cruelty, slowly rose from his chair. His face was pale, his expression a mixture of shame and dawning horror as he truly saw his wife's actions for what they were. The silence stretched on, heavy with implications that no one yet fully understood. The torn fabric hung like a banner of shame in the crystalline silence that had descended upon Grandview Manor restaurant. Emma stood frozen, her hands trembling as she attempted to hold together the remnants of her uniform, while Victoria basked in the immediate aftermath of her cruel display. The socialite's chest rose and fell with the exhilaration of someone who had just asserted their dominance in the most public way possible. But as the seconds ticked by, the atmosphere in the restaurant began to shift in ways Victoria hadn't anticipated. The silence that had initially felt like validation for her actions started to take on a different quality. Where she had expected murmurs of agreement or at least understanding from her fellow diners, she found instead a growing sense of discomfort that rippled through the room like stones dropped in still water. Margaret, the restaurant manager, was the first to break the spell. Her years of experience in high-end hospitality had taught her to navigate delicate situations with wealthy clientele. But what she had just witnessed crossed every line of human decency she had ever encountered. "Mrs. Sterling," Margaret's voice cut through the silence with professional authority that barely concealed her outrage. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises immediately." Victoria whirled around, her face flushing with indignation. The very idea that she, a woman of her status and influence, could be asked to leave anywhere was so foreign to her worldview that she struggled to process it. "Excuse me?" Victoria's voice rose to a pitch that made several diners wince. "Do you have any idea who I am? Do you understand what my husband's business means to this establishment?" Alexander remained seated, but his knuckles had gone white where they gripped the edge of the table. For the first time in their marriage, he was seeing his wife through the eyes of strangers, and the view was nauseating. The woman he had married, the woman he had built a life with, stood before him revealed as something monstrous, Emma, meanwhile, had found her voice despite the shock and humiliation coursing through her system. "It's okay," she said quietly, addressing Margaret while keeping her eyes carefully averted from Victoria. "I can handle this. It's not the first time someone has tried to make me feel small." The simple dignity in Emma's words hit the room like a physical force. Here was a young woman who had just been publicly humiliated and physically assaulted, yet she spoke with more grace and composure than the woman who had attacked her. The contrast was stark and impossible to ignore. "No," Margaret said firmly, her protective instincts for her staff overriding any concerns about wealthy customers. "This is not acceptable behavior, and it will not be tolerated in my establishment, regardless of who thinks they're above basic human decency." Victoria's face contorted with rage as she realized that her usual tools of intimidation were failing her. The deference she had come to expect, the automatic submission to her wealth and status, was nowhere to be found. Instead, she faced a room full of people who were looking at her with expressions ranging from disgust to outright contempt. "You people don't understand," Victoria snarled, her composure cracking like ice under pressure. "There's an order to things. There are standards that must be maintained. When someone like her," she pointed a manicured finger at Emma, "forgets her place, it's up to people like me to remind them." An elderly gentleman at a nearby table, someone Victoria recognized as a member of her own social circle, slowly rose from his seat. His wife tugged at his sleeve, clearly uncomfortable with the developing confrontation, but he gently freed himself from her grasp. "Victoria," the man said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard, "what you've just done is inexcusable. There is no justification, no social order, no standard that makes it acceptable to physically assault another human being." The public condemnation from someone within her own social stratum hit Victoria like a slap. She had expected solidarity from her peers, had counted on their shared understanding of social hierarchies and proper behavior. Instead, she found herself increasingly isolated as more diners began to murmur their disapproval. Alexander finally stood, moving with the heavy steps of a man carrying an enormous burden. He reached into his wallet and withdrew several bills, placing them on the table with deliberate care. "Margaret," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "please send me the bill for any damages and ensure that Emma is compensated for this incident, whatever she needs." Victoria stared at her husband in disbelief. "Alexander, what are you doing? You're taking their side against your own wife." "I'm taking the side of basic human decency," Alexander replied, meeting his wife's gaze for the first time since the incident began. "Something I should have done years ago." The words hung in the air like a death sentence for their marriage. Victoria felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as she realized that the man she had counted on to support her actions, to validate her worldview, was instead standing against her. Emma, who had been quietly trying to make herself invisible during the escalating confrontation, suddenly found herself at the center of Alexander's attention. He approached her with careful, respectful steps, as if afraid that any sudden movement might cause her to flee. "I cannot apologize enough for what my wife has done," Alexander said, his voice breaking slightly. "There is no excuse, no explanation that makes this acceptable. If there's anything I can do, anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and Emma found herself looking up into the face of a man who appeared to be genuinely devastated by his wife's actions. She had expected him to defend Victoria, to close ranks as wealthy people often did when confronted with their own cruelty. "Thank you," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible above the continued murmurs of the other diners. "I just want to go home." Victoria watched this exchange with growing horror, as she realized that her moment of triumph had transformed into something else entirely. The public humiliation she had intended to inflict on Emma was reflecting back on her with compound interest. She had become the villain in a story she had meant to author quite differently. "This is ridiculous," Victoria declared, her voice shrill with desperation. "You're all overreacting to a simple correction of inappropriate behavior. That girl was being disrespectful, and I merely reminded her of her position." But her words fell on deaf ears. The other diners had seen what they had seen, and no amount of justification could erase the image of a wealthy woman physically attacking someone whose only crime was trying to do her job with dignity. Margaret stepped forward again, her patience finally exhausted. "Mrs. Sterling, You have 30 seconds to leave this restaurant voluntarily, or I will call security to escort you out. The choice is yours. The threat of being physically removed from the premises was the final humiliation Victoria couldn't bear. With as much dignity as she could muster, she gathered her purse and straightened her shoulders. "You'll all regret this," she said, her voice carrying a promise of retribution that fooled no one. "I have influence in this city. I have connections you can't imagine." But as she looked around the room one final time, Victoria realized that her threats rang hollow. The influence she had spent years cultivating, the social capital she had accumulated through fear and intimidation, was evaporating before her eyes. Alexander remained behind as his wife stormed toward the exit, her heels clicking angrily against the polished floor. He found himself in the unprecedented position of having to choose between his marriage and his conscience, and for the first time in years, the choice felt surprisingly clear. As the restaurant door slammed shut behind Victoria, the silence that followed was different from the one that had preceded her departure. This silence carried the weight of consequence, of lines crossed, and relationships forever altered. Emma stood in the center of it all, clutching her torn uniform, unaware that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. The drive home from Grandview Manor restaurant passed in suffocating silence. Victoria sat rigid in the passenger seat of their luxury sedan, her perfectly manicured nails digging crescents into her palms as she stared out the window at the city lights blurring past. Alexander gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscle twitched with barely contained emotion. The silence between them wasn't the comfortable quiet of a couple at ease with each other. This was the heavy, oppressive silence that follows an earthquake, when the damage is still being assessed and the aftershocks threaten to bring down whatever structures remain standing. Victoria finally broke first, her voice sharp with defensive anger. "I hope you're satisfied with yourself, Alexander. The way you humiliated me in front of everyone, taking that girl's side against your own wife." Alexander's hands tightened on the wheel, but he kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I didn't humiliate you, Victoria. You managed that all by yourself when you put your hands on that young woman." "Put my hands on her?" Victoria's voice rose to a near shriek. "I was teaching her a lesson about respect, about knowing her place in society. Someone had to show her that actions have consequences." The irony of her words wasn't lost on Alexander, though he doubted his wife understood the deeper meaning of what she had just said. Actions did indeed have consequences, and Victoria was about to learn that lesson in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. Her place in society? Alexander finally turned to look at his wife as they stopped at a red light. "And what exactly do you think her place is, Victoria? What gives you the right to determine someone else's worth based on their job?" Victoria stared at him as if he had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. "Alexander, surely you can't be serious. We are who we are because we've earned it. We've worked for our position, and we deserve the respect that comes with it. People like that waitress need to understand the natural order of things." "Natural order?" Alexander's laugh was bitter and hollow. "Victoria, do you even hear yourself? There's nothing natural about the way you treated that girl tonight. There's nothing earned about cruelty." The light turned green, and Alexander pressed the accelerator perhaps a little harder than necessary. The tension in the car was reaching a breaking point, and both of them could feel the weight of years of unspoken truths pressing down on them. "You've changed," Victoria said, her voice taking on a wounded quality that she hoped might manipulate him back to her side. "The Alexander I married would never have embarrassed me like that. He would have supported me, defended me. The Alexander you married was a coward," he replied quietly, the admission hanging in the air like a confession. "He was so afraid of conflict, so desperate to keep the peace, that he allowed you to become something monstrous, without ever saying a word." Victoria recoiled as if she'd been slapped. "Monstrous! How dare you speak to me that way? I am your wife. I deserve your loyalty, your protection." "You deserve honesty," Alexander countered, pulling into their circular driveway. "And the honest truth is that watching you attack that girl tonight was the most disgusting thing I've ever witnessed. It showed me exactly what kind of person I've been enabling all these years." As they sat in their driveway, the engine ticking as it cooled, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced in years: genuine fear. Not fear of physical harm or financial loss, but fear of losing the control she had wielded over her husband for so long. "Alexander, please," she said. her voice softer now, almost pleading. "We can work through this. What happened tonight was just a misunderstanding. I was having a bad day and maybe I overreacted slightly." "Slightly?" Alexander turned to face her fully, and Victoria was startled by the coldness in his eyes. "Victoria, you physically assaulted another human being because she had the audacity to do her job with dignity. You tore her clothing in front of a room full of people because she wouldn't cower before you." The clinical way he described her actions made them sound even worse than they had felt in the moment. Victoria struggled to find words that would minimize what had happened, that would restore the balance of power in their relationship. She was being disrespectful, Victoria insisted, but even to her own ears, the justification sounded weak and hollow. She needed to be reminded of proper behavior. "The only person who displayed improper behavior tonight was you," Alexander said as he opened his car door. "And I'm done pretending otherwise." Inside their sprawling mansion, the weight of luxury felt oppressive rather than comforting. The marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and expensive artwork that Victoria had always seen as symbols of their success now seemed like monuments to their moral bankruptcy. Alexander headed straight for his study, but Victoria followed him, her heels clicking frantically on the polished floors as she struggled to keep up with his determined stride. "Where are you going?" she demanded. "We need to talk about this. We need to figure out how to handle the fallout from tonight." Alexander began pulling files from his desk drawers, his movements sharp and purposeful. "The only fallout I'm concerned about is making sure that young woman is properly compensated for what you did to her." Victoria watched in growing alarm as her husband gathered papers with the efficiency of someone who had already made a decision. "What are you doing with those files?" "I'm going to find out everything I can about Emma," Alexander replied without looking up. "I'm going to make sure she has the resources she needs to recover from tonight. And I'm going to ensure that she never has to worry about someone like you again." The casual way he dismissed her, the complete absence of concern for her feelings or reputation, sent a chill through Victoria that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. "Someone like me?" Victoria's voice cracked slightly. "Alexander, I'm your wife, your partner. How can you speak about me as if I'm some kind of stranger?" Alexander finally looked up from his papers, and Victoria was shocked by the exhaustion and sadness in his expression. "Because tonight, watching you in that restaurant, I realized that you are a stranger. The woman I married, the woman I thought I knew, would never have done what you did." "People don't just change overnight," Victoria protested. But even as she said the words, she could feel their falseness. She had changed, gradually and incrementally, allowing her wealth and status to transform her into something she wouldn't have recognized in her younger self. "You're right," Alexander agreed. "People don't change overnight. This has been building for years, and I've been too much of a coward to see it or address it. But tonight was the final straw. Tonight showed me exactly who you've become, and I can't be married to that person anymore." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. In all their years together, through arguments and disagreements and moments of tension, divorce had never been mentioned. It had been an unthinkable concept, a line that would never be crossed. "You don't mean that," Victoria whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're just upset. Tomorrow you'll see things differently." Alexander shook his head slowly, sadly. "Tomorrow I'm going to call my lawyer. Tonight was the end of something, Victoria. I just hope that someday you'll understand that." As he walked past her toward the door, Victoria felt her world tilting on its axis. Everything she had built, every assumption she had made about her life and her relationships, was crumbling around her. "Alexander, wait," she called after him, but he didn't turn around. "I'll be staying in the guest house tonight," he said without stopping. "We'll talk more when we've both had time to process what happened." Alone in the study, surrounded by the trappings of success that suddenly felt meaningless, Victoria finally began to understand that actions truly did have consequences. The question was whether she would learn from them or allow them to destroy everything she had left. The guest house had never felt so much like a sanctuary and a prison at the same time. Alexander sat in the leather armchair by the window, still wearing his dinner clothes from what felt like a lifetime ago, watching the main house where his wife presumably wrestled with the consequences of her actions. The ice in his whiskey had long since melted, leaving behind a watery amber reflection of his fractured marriage. Sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emma's face in that moment when Victoria's hand connected with her uniform, the shock and humiliation that had flickered across her features before she composed herself with dignity that put his wife's behavior to shame. The image haunted him, not just for its cruelty, but for what it revealed about his own complicity in creating the monster his wife had become. Meanwhile, in the main house, Victoria paced the marble floors of their bedroom like a caged animal. Her designer dress from the evening lay crumpled on the floor where she had torn it off in frustration, replacing it with silk pajamas that provided no comfort against the cold reality of her situation. The room that had always been her refuge, filled with luxury and beauty, now felt like a mausoleum of her own making. She had tried calling her closest friends, the women who formed her inner circle of social influence, but each conversation had gone worse than the last. Word of the restaurant incident had already begun to spread through their exclusive community, carried by the shocked whispers of witnesses who couldn't believe what they had seen. "Victoria, darling," Penelope Hartwell had said during their brief phone conversation, her voice dripping with false concern. "I've been hearing the most disturbing rumors about tonight. Please tell me there's been some terrible misunderstanding." But when Victoria had attempted to explain her side of the story, to paint Emma as disrespectful and herself as merely maintaining proper standards, Penelope's response had been swift and devastating. "My dear, I think you need to understand something. What you're describing isn't maintaining standards. It's assault. And frankly, if these stories are true, I don't think we can be seen associating with that kind of behavior." The conversation had ended abruptly, leaving Victoria with the sinking realization that her social standing was crumbling as quickly as her marriage. The network of relationships she had spent years cultivating through intimidation and manipulation was revealing itself to be built on nothing more substantial than fear, and fear evaporated quickly when the one inspiring it showed weakness. Back in the guest house, Alexander had opened his laptop and was doing something he had never done before, researching his wife's victim. Emma Martinez, he discovered, was 23 years old and had been working at Grandview Manor restaurant for nearly 2 years. She was enrolled in community college, studying business administration while working multiple jobs to pay for her education. The more he learned, the more ashamed he became. Here was a young woman working tirelessly to better herself, showing the kind of determination and character that he had once possessed before wealth and comfort had made him complacent. She represented everything admirable about the human spirit, while his wife had revealed everything deplorable about privilege unchecked by conscience. His phone buzzed with a text message, and Alexander was surprised to see it was from Margaret, the restaurant manager. He had given her his card before leaving, asking her to contact him about compensation for Emma, but he hadn't expected to hear from her so quickly. "Mr. Sterling, I hope you don't mind me reaching out so late. Emma finished her shift, but she's quite shaken. She's worried about losing her job because of the incident. I assured her that wouldn't happen, but I thought you should know how she's handling things." Alexander's heart clenched at the thought that Emma might blame herself for what had happened, that she might fear professional consequences for being the victim of his wife's cruelty. He typed back immediately, "Please assure Emma that she has nothing to worry about. I will personally guarantee her employment security and would like to discuss additional support. Could we meet tomorrow?" The response came quickly. She would be grateful for that. "Noon at the restaurant?" "I'll be there," Alexander replied, then set his phone aside and stared out at the main house again. Somewhere in that building, his wife was probably plotting her next move, trying to figure out how to spin the evening's events to her advantage. But for the first time in their marriage, Alexander didn't care about Victoria's schemes or manipulations. His focus was entirely on trying to repair the damage she had caused. In the main house, Victoria's pacing had finally stopped. She stood before her bathroom mirror, studying her reflection with the kind of brutal honesty she hadn't employed in years. The woman looking back at her was still beautiful, still expensively maintained, but there was something hollow in her eyes that cosmetics couldn't disguise. When had she become this person? When had her natural confidence transformed into cruel arrogance? When had her desire for respect become a need to humiliate others? The questions circled in her mind like vultures, picking at the carcass of her self-image. She remembered being young, remembered working her own service job during college to pay for textbooks and rent. She had been kind to customers then, understanding that everyone was fighting battles she couldn't see. That girl seemed like a stranger now, someone from another lifetime, who had been slowly suffocated by layers of wealth and status. Her phone rang, jolting her from her uncomfortable self-reflection. The caller ID showed her mother's name, and Victoria's stomach dropped. If her mother was calling this late, it meant the news had already reached her parents' social circle. "Mother," Victoria answered, trying to inject confidence into her voice. "Victoria Elizabeth Sterling." Her mother's voice was ice-cold with disappointment. "I have just received 3 separate phone calls about your behavior at dinner tonight. Please tell me that Mrs. Pemberton was exaggerating when she said you physically attacked a waitress." The use of her full name transported Victoria back to childhood, to moments when she had been caught in wrongdoing and forced to face consequences. But this wasn't a broken vase or a poor grade on a test. This was her entire adult life imploding in real time. "Mother, you don't understand the full situation," Victoria began, but her mother cut her off. "I understand that my daughter, whom I raised to treat all people with dignity and respect, apparently forgot every lesson I ever taught her about being a decent human being." The words hit Victoria harder than any physical blow could have. Her mother's disappointment was a weight she hadn't carried since adolescence, and she found herself crumbling under its familiar pressure. "I don't know what happened to me," Victoria whispered, the admission escaping before she could stop it. "I don't know when I became someone who could do something like that." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for long moments before her mother spoke again, her voice softer but no less serious. "The question isn't when you became that person, Victoria. The question is what you're going to do now that you know who you've become." After the call ended, Victoria found herself sitting on the edge of her bed, surrounded by luxury that suddenly felt meaningless. For the first time in years, she was forced to confront the reality of who she had become without the buffer of enablers or the distraction of social obligations. Outside, dawn was beginning to creep across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gray that seemed appropriate for the end of everything she had built her life around. Somewhere in the city, a young woman named Emma was probably lying awake as well, replaying the evening's events and wondering what kind of world she lived in where such cruelty was possible. And in the guest house, Alexander sat planning how to rebuild what his wife had destroyed, both for Emma and for himself. The reckoning was just beginning. The noon sun streamed through the windows of Grandview Manor restaurant as Alexander arrived for his meeting with Emma. The dining room looked different in daylight, less intimidating, more vulnerable somehow, like a theater set exposed without the magic of evening lighting. Margaret greeted him at the entrance, her professional demeanor softened by genuine concern. "She's in the back office," Margaret said quietly, leading him through the restaurant. "I want you to know, Mr. Sterling, that Emma is one of the finest employees we've ever had. What happened last night? It's shaken her more than she's willing to admit." Alexander nodded, his throat tight with emotion he was still learning to process. The weight of his wife's actions seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour, and he found himself questioning not just Victoria's behavior, but his own years of silent complicity. Emma was sitting at a small desk when they entered the office, still wearing her restaurant uniform but looking somehow smaller than she had the night before. Her shoulders were set with determined dignity, but Alexander could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the kind that came from a sleepless night spent replaying traumatic moments. "Emma," he said softly, "thank you for agreeing to meet with me." She looked up, and Alexander was struck again by the composure she maintained, despite everything she had endured. "Mr. Sterling, I appreciate you coming, but you really didn't need to. I'm fine." The automatic response, the instinct to minimize her own suffering, reminded Alexander painfully of his younger self, always trying to smooth over conflict, always afraid to make waves. But Emma's strength came from a different place than his former cowardice had. "You shouldn't have to be fine," Alexander said, taking the chair Margaret offered him. "What my wife did to you was unacceptable, and I want to make sure you understand that her actions don't reflect how you should be treated by anyone." Emma's carefully maintained composure wavered slightly. "Mr. Sterling, I've been working service jobs since I was 16. I've dealt with difficult customers before. But last night," she paused, searching for words. "I've never had someone look at me with such hatred just for existing." The simple honesty of her statement hit Alexander like a physical blow. He realized that while he had been focused on the dramatic spectacle of Victoria's behavior, Emma had experienced something much more personal and devastating. The crushing realization that some people saw her as fundamentally less human than themselves. "Emma, I need you to know something," Alexander said, leaning forward with urgent sincerity. "My wife's behavior had nothing to do with you or your worth as a person. It came from something broken inside her that I should have addressed years ago." Margaret, who had been quietly observing the conversation, spoke up. "Emma, why don't you tell Mr. Sterling about your situation? I think he should understand the full context of what happened." Emma hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of discussing her personal life with someone of Alexander's obvious wealth and status. But something in his expression encouraged her to continue. "I'm working 3 jobs to put myself through college," she began slowly. "Days here at the restaurant, evenings cleaning offices, and weekends at a catering company. I'm studying business administration because I want to open my own restaurant someday. Last night, when she tore my uniform, all I could think about was whether I would lose this job and not be able to pay for next semester's tuition." The practical concerns underlying her trauma made Alexander's shame even more acute. While Victoria had been playing power games with someone's dignity, Emma had been worried about survival, about the future she was working so hard to build. "You won't lose your job," Alexander said firmly. "In fact, I want to discuss something with you that might change your situation entirely." Emma looked puzzled, and Margaret raised an eyebrow with interest. "I've been doing some research," Alexander continued, "and I've learned about your academic performance, your work ethic, your goals. Emma, what if I told you that you never had to worry about tuition again? What if I offered you a full scholarship to complete your degree and a guaranteed position in my company's management training program?" The offer hung in the air like something too good to be real. Emma stared at him in disbelief, while Margaret smiled with genuine pleasure at seeing her employee receive such unexpected good fortune. "Mr. Sterling, I can't accept charity," Emma said quietly, her pride evident despite her obvious need. "I appreciate the gesture, but I don't want your money because you feel guilty about your wife." "This isn't charity," Alexander replied, respecting her dignity even as he tried to help her understand the opportunity. "This is an investment in someone who has already proven they have the character and determination to succeed. Emma, I've built a successful company, but I've lost sight of what real leadership looks like. You've shown me more about integrity in one night than I've seen in years of boardroom meetings." Emma looked to Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. "Emma, you've earned this. Your work, your character, your perseverance, they speak for themselves. Don't let pride keep you from accepting help when it's offered with genuine respect." As Emma considered the offer, Alexander found himself thinking about the conversation he would need to have with Victoria when he returned home. Their marriage was over. That much had become clear during his sleepless night in the guest house. But perhaps something positive could emerge from the wreckage of their relationship. "There's something else," Alexander said, his voice taking on a quality of resolve that surprised even him. "I want to start a foundation. A scholarship program for students like you, people who are working multiple jobs to pay for their education, who have the determination to succeed but lack the resources. I want my wife's cruelty to become the catalyst for something that helps rather than hurts." The transformation of Victoria's actions into something constructive felt like a kind of redemption, not for her, but for the situation itself. Alexander realized he was describing not just a foundation, but a new purpose for his own life. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of hope rather than despair. "Mr. Sterling, if you're serious about this, it would change everything. Not just for me, but for so many people who are struggling the way I have been." "I'm completely serious," Alexander assured her. "And Emma, I want you to be involved in running it. Your perspective, your understanding of what it's like to work for every opportunity, that's exactly what this foundation needs." As they discussed the details of both Emma's scholarship and the broader foundation, Alexander felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose that went beyond accumulating wealth or maintaining social status. He was discovering that helping others achieve their potential was infinitely more satisfying than anything his previous life had offered. Meanwhile, across town, Victoria sat in her empty mansion, scrolling through social media and watching her carefully curated image crumble in real time. Photos from the previous night had begun appearing online, taken by restaurant patrons who had witnessed her attack on Emma. The captions were uniformly damning, and the comments beneath them were even worse. Her phone buzzed with a text from her lawyer. "Victoria, we need to discuss the situation immediately. There may be legal implications beyond the obvious marital issues." Legal implications. The words made her stomach clench with fear she hadn't felt since childhood. Her actions at the restaurant hadn't just destroyed her marriage and social standing. They might have criminal consequences as well. For the first time since the incident, Victoria began to understand that this wasn't a temporary setback she could manipulate her way out of. This was a complete collapse of everything she had built her identity around, and the woman responsible for the destruction was staring back at her from every mirror in her suddenly meaningless mansion. The reckoning she had avoided for so long was finally demanding its due. The law offices of Harrison, Mitchell & Associates occupied an entire floor of downtown's most prestigious building. But Victoria had never felt smaller as she sat across from her attorney's imposing mahogany desk. David Harrison's expression was grave as he reviewed the documents spread before him, occasionally glancing up at his client with the kind of look reserved for those who had created their own disasters. "Victoria, I'm going to be direct with you," David began, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades of legal experience. "The video footage from the restaurant is damning. Multiple witnesses have already given statements, and the incident was recorded on the establishment's security cameras. We're looking at potential charges of assault and battery." Victoria's hands trembled as she reached for her coffee cup, the expensive china rattling against the saucer. Surely there must be something we can do, some way to minimize this situation. That girl was being disrespectful, and I was simply correcting her behavior. David's expression hardened. "Victoria, I need you to understand something very clearly. There is no legal justification for what you did. None. The video shows you physically attacking an employee who was simply doing her job. Your perceived slight, real or imagined, does not give you the right to put your hands on another person." The reality of her situation was beginning to penetrate the protective bubble of denial Victoria had constructed around herself. Criminal charges, court appearances, public humiliation on a scale she had never imagined. The social consequences she was already experiencing would pale in comparison to legal proceedings that would make her behavior a matter of public record. "What are my options?" Victoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Limited," David replied honestly. "We can negotiate with the district attorney's office, possibly arrange for community service and anger management counseling in exchange for reduced charges. But Victoria, you need to understand that your best option is to take responsibility for your actions and show genuine remorse." The concept of public accountability was foreign to Victoria's worldview. Throughout her adult life, money and influence had provided insulation from consequences, creating a reality where apologies were strategic rather than sincere. Meanwhile, across town, Emma was experiencing her own form of transformation. The scholarship Alexander had offered was more than financial security. It represented validation that her dreams were achievable, that her worth wasn't determined by the cruelty of others. She sat in the admissions office of Metropolitan University, paperwork spread before her as she officially enrolled in their accelerated business program. "Ms. Martinez," the admissions counselor said with genuine enthusiasm, "your academic record is impressive, especially considering your work schedule. The Sterling Foundation Scholarship will allow you to focus entirely on your studies. You should be very proud." Emma smiled, but her thoughts drifted to the strange twist of fate that had brought her to this moment. Victoria's attack had been traumatic, humiliating, and completely unjustified. Yet somehow, that moment of cruelty had connected her with Alexander Sterling, a man whose guilt over his wife's behavior had transformed into a commitment to creating positive change. "I want to make sure I honor this opportunity," Emma said seriously. "Mr. Sterling is giving me a chance that will change my entire life trajectory." The counselor nodded approvingly. "From what I understand, the foundation plans to help many students in similar situations. Your success will pave the way for others." The weight of that responsibility felt good to Emma, purposeful rather than burdensome. She understood that her journey from working 3 jobs to pursuing her dreams full-time would inspire other young people facing similar struggles. Back at the Sterling mansion, Alexander was meeting with his own attorney, but for very different reasons. The divorce proceedings would be straightforward given their prenuptial agreement, but Alexander was more interested in discussing the establishment of the Sterling Foundation for Educational Opportunity. The initial funding will be $50 million, Alexander explained to his legal team. I want the foundation to provide full scholarships to students who demonstrate academic potential, but lack financial resources. Emma Martinez will serve as the program director once she completes her degree. His attorney, Sarah Chen, looked up from her notes with interest. That's quite a significant commitment, Alexander. Are you certain about placing someone so young in such a responsible position? Emma has more integrity and determination than most executives I've worked with, Alexander replied without hesitation. She understands the struggles these students face because she's lived them. That perspective is invaluable. As he spoke about the foundation, Alexander felt a clarity of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. His marriage to Victoria had been built on shared social ambitions and mutual convenience rather than genuine connection or common values. Now, freed from that relationship, he was discovering what truly mattered to him. His phone buzzed with a text from Margaret at the restaurant. Emma's last day is tomorrow. She wanted to finish her commitments before starting school. Thought you should know. She's handling everything with remarkable grace. Alexander smiled at the message. Emma's professionalism, even after everything she had endured, exemplified the character he hoped to support through the foundation. Her insistence on completing her work obligations despite having other options demonstrated the kind of integrity that couldn't be taught or bought. Victoria, meanwhile, was discovering just how quickly her social world could collapse. The country club where she had reigned as an unofficial queen bee had quietly suggested she might want to take some time away from club activities. The charity boards where she had served had politely requested her resignation. Even her hairdresser had called to reschedule her standing appointment indefinitely. The isolation was complete and crushing. For someone whose identity had been entirely built on social status and the fear-based respect of others, losing that foundation left her feeling utterly lost. She wandered through her mansion like a ghost, surrounded by luxury that now felt meaningless. Her mother had called again that morning, and the conversation had been even more difficult than the previous one. Victoria, I've spoken with your father, and we've decided that you need professional help, her mother had said with firm compassion. This behavior, this cruelty toward another human being, is not who we raised you to be. Something has gone very wrong, and you need to face that honestly. The suggestion of therapy felt like another humiliation to Victoria, another admission that she was somehow broken or defective. But as she sat alone in her empty house, she began to wonder if her mother might be right. When had helping others stopped feeling natural? When had kindness become foreign to her nature? Her phone rang, interrupting her spiraling thoughts. The caller ID showed David Harrison's office. Victoria, her attorney's voice was serious. I've just spoken with the district attorney's office. Emma Martinez has decided not to press charges. Victoria's relief was immediate and overwhelming. She's not pressing charges? But why? I thought, she's not pressing charges on one condition, David continued. She wants you to perform 200 hours of community service at local homeless shelters and food banks, and she wants you to complete an anger management program. She also wants a written apology that acknowledges the harm you caused. The conditions felt both merciful and challenging. Emma was offering Victoria a path to redemption that didn't involve criminal prosecution, but it required genuine accountability and service to people Victoria had spent years ignoring or dismissing. She could have destroyed me legally, Victoria whispered, finally understanding the magnitude of Emma's character. Why would she show me this kind of mercy? According to her statement, David replied, she believes that punishment should serve the purpose of education and growth, not just retribution. She thinks community service might help you understand the value of treating all people with dignity. As Victoria hung up the phone, she realized that Emma had just given her something precious and unexpected, a second chance. The young woman she had humiliated had responded to cruelty with grace, to attack with forgiveness, to hatred with hope for redemption. For the first time since the restaurant incident, Victoria felt something other than anger or fear. She felt the stirring of genuine remorse, not for the consequences she faced, but for the pain she had caused another human being. Emma's mercy had accomplished what legal threats and social exile could not. It had reached through Victoria's defensive walls and touched whatever remained of her conscience. The question now was whether Victoria would prove worthy of the second chance she had been given, or whether years of entitlement and cruelty had damaged her beyond repair. The answer would determine not just her legal fate, but whether any part of her former humanity could be recovered. Outside, the city continued its daily rhythm, unaware that in a mansion overlooking its skyline, a woman was taking her first tentative steps toward understanding what it truly meant to be human. Years later, the transformation was complete, but not in the way anyone could have predicted. Victoria Sterling stood before a room full of formerly homeless individuals at the downtown community center, her hands no longer manicured to perfection, but calloused from honest work. The designer clothes had been replaced by simple, practical attire that spoke of someone who had learned the difference between appearance and substance. "When I first came here to fulfill my community service," Victoria said, her voice carrying a humility that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who knew her before, "I thought I was doing penance. I thought this was punishment for a moment of weakness. I had no idea that this place would save my life." In the audience, Emma Martinez Sterling sat beside her husband, Alexander, their wedding rings catching the afternoon light. The marriage had been a surprise to everyone, except those who had witnessed their shared commitment to lifting others up. Emma's transformation from struggling waitress to foundation director had been remarkable, but her partnership with Alexander had created something even more powerful. The Sterling Foundation has now provided full scholarships to over 5,000 students, Emma announced as she took the podium. But today we're not just celebrating numbers. We're celebrating the proof that one moment of choosing kindness over cruelty can change the entire trajectory of countless lives. Margaret, the former restaurant manager, who now served as the foundation's operations director, wiped away tears as she watched Victoria volunteer at the serving station. The woman who had once treated service workers as invisible had become one of the most dedicated volunteers they had ever seen. Victoria's community service had stretched far beyond the required 200 hours. She had discovered something at the shelter that her mansion had never provided: purpose. Working alongside people who had lost everything, she learned that dignity wasn't something you earned through wealth or status. It was something inherent in being human, something she had spent years trying to strip away from others and, in the process, from herself. "The most beautiful part of this story," Alexander said during his closing remarks, "is that what began as the worst night of our lives became the catalyst for the best years." Victoria's attack on Emma was inexcusable, but Emma's response taught us all what true strength looks like. She chose to transform hatred into healing, humiliation into hope. Victoria approached Emma after the ceremony, something she had done hundreds of times over the years, but today felt different. Today marked the 5th anniversary of the restaurant incident that had changed everything. "Emma," Victoria said quietly, "I know I've apologized countless times, but I need you to know that serving alongside you has taught me what I should have learned decades ago. Every person matters. Every person deserves dignity. Thank you for seeing something in me worth saving when I couldn't see it myself." Emma smiled, the same gentle strength that had carried her through that terrible night now radiating from her as a successful businesswoman, foundation leader, and mentor to countless young people. "Victoria, we saved each other," Emma replied. "Your cruelty broke something in you that needed to be broken. My forgiveness broke something in me that needed to be broken too. We both learned that our worst moments don't have to define us if we're willing to do the work to become better." As the sun set over the city, 3 lives that had collided in the worst possible way had been transformed into something beautiful. Victoria had found redemption through service. Alexander had found purpose through partnership with someone who shared his values. Emma had found that forgiveness could be its own form of power. The Sterling Foundation continued to grow, but more importantly, it had created a ripple effect of compassion that spread far beyond scholarships and programs. Hundreds of volunteers had joined their mission, inspired by the story of how cruelty had been transformed into kindness through the simple choice to respond to hatred with love. Standing together in the community center they had all helped to build, the 3 of them represented something powerful, proof that redemption is always possible, that second chances can create miracles, and that sometimes the most broken people become the most beautiful when they finally learn to heal. The golden key to transformation wasn't wealth or status or power. It was the courage to choose compassion over cruelty, one decision at a time, until it became a way of life.